Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another edition of 3 Wide. This weekend the Monster Energy NASCAR Cup Series was at Richmond Raceway for the Federated Auto Parts 400. My overall thoughts on this race is that it was a good race. I don't feel like this was a terrible race. This was better than most of the races we've had all season, and this race wasn't like watching paint dry. We had action throughout the pack for most of this race, and we had some battles up front for the lead. The biggest X factor in this race was how people would adjust on their cars and who had a long run car, who could sustain throughout the runs, and who had a short run car. We saw guys' cars who could go in the long run, such as Chase Elliott, who would fade back in the early stages and all of a sudden would come roaring up to the front throughout the run in this race. And then we had guys who would work on their cars, who were able to sustain runs throughout the race, and those guys would end up in the front when the race was all said and done. So now we'll get into my 3 takeaways from the Federated Auto Parts 400. Number 1. Kyle Busch sweeps Richmond. When the Cup Series first visited Richmond Raceway earlier this year in April, it was Kyle Busch who took the checkered flag to cap off his first three-peat of the NASCAR season. So going into this weekend's race, everyone was wondering if Kyle Busch would replicate what he did earlier in the season. But as the night went on, Kyle Busch was pretty much an afterthought in this race. He didn't get any stage points throughout this race, where in stage 1 he finished 13th, and in stage 2 he finished 11th, just missing out on points. So moving into the final stage, the last 200 laps of the race at Richmond, Kyle Busch's team worked on the car well enough to where he became a good contender later in this race, to where he dueled with Brad Keselowski in the latter parts of this race and would battle with him for a good amount of laps, to where he would take the lead and would never look back. Kevin Harvick tried to make it interesting, but he could never catch up, and Kyle Busch would go on to win and advance in the playoffs. With Kyle advancing in the playoffs, that means the next week's race at the Roval, there will be no pressure on him to where he can do whatever he wants. With him having no pressure and can just do whatever he feels like doing with that car, if it's up to par, he could be one of the great things to watch at the debut at the Roval. Now on to number 2. Playoffers who bounced back. After last weekend's Demolition Derby in Las Vegas, many of the playoff drivers were looking to bounce back at Richmond to salvage what was taken away from them at Las Vegas. 3 drivers who stuck out to me who bounced back in a great way were Jimmie Johnson, who ended up finishing 8th. He finished 8th in the second stage, getting him stage points. So now we'll see going into the Roval if Jimmie Johnson can put 2 top 10s together for the first time since the Coke 600 and the first Pocono race earlier in the season. Second driver was Chase Elliott. After Chase Elliott was taken out in a wreck involving Jamie McMurray, who lost the tire in Las Vegas, Chase finished 4th in every part of this race. Stage 1 he finished 4th, stage 2 he finished 4th, and the final finishing position for him was 4th. As I said earlier in this, he had a long run car, and when that caution came out late in the race, his long run car really couldn't make up enough to get towards the front when the checker flag flew at Richmond. And the final driver was Kevin Harvick. Kevin Harvick lost the tire last weekend at Las Vegas and took out Erik Jones. So now Harvick, after an abysmal finish at Las Vegas, bounced back, finishing 2nd in all the stages and finished 2nd in this race. With Harvick's great run in both stages and finishing 2nd, he's now plus 57, pretty much assuring him to move on in the next round of the playoffs, and could probably take the Roval easy and just not screw anything up. He'll be moving on to the next round. Now on to number 3. Playoffers who struggled. If you needed a week to struggle in the playoffs, I feel like last weekend at Las Vegas was the place to do it. With all the playoff drivers who had problems, which felt like about 12 drivers who had issues, this weekend at Richmond was not the place to do it, because in the final finishing results, the first 12 drivers who crossed the line at Richmond were all playoff eligible drivers. So if you even had a minor hiccup this weekend at Richmond, it looks like a bigger hole considering how good all the playoff drivers did in this race. Some guys who put themselves a little deeper into a hole, or maybe took away from what they had on the drivers below them, were Kurt Busch, who ended up finishing 18th. Kurt was plus 24 on the cutoff line heading into Richmond. He's now only plus 15, so he lost 9 points with just a minor hiccup at Richmond. The other driver was Denny Hamlin. Denny Hamlin ended up finishing 16th. After a bad weekend in Las Vegas where he was the low man on the totem pole, being last in this playoff grid, a hiccup at Richmond wasn't in the cards for Hamlin, but it ended up happening to him, and he lost even more ground. He lost 9 points to the 12th place driver. He's now minus 29, looking up to try to get in. So going into the Roval this weekend, it looks like Denny Hamlin's going to have to win to get in and advance. The third driver who had huge problems at Richmond was Ryan Blaney. Ryan Blaney finished the worst out of all the playoff drivers, finishing in the 19th position. Ryan Blaney lost 16 points. He fell from 7th in the standings plus 20 to now only being 4 points ahead of the cutoff line going into the Roval, which we all believe will be unpredictable. He sits in the 12th position. And the last guy who didn't help his cause at Richmond was Erik Jones. Erik Jones ended up finishing 11th, which 11th place is a decent finish, but with all the playoff drivers doing so good, and him, I believe, finishing last at Las Vegas, this isn't a good performance for Eric Jones. Eric Jones sits 21 points behind the cutoff line and looks like he'll need a Christmas miracle to move on at the Roval. And I feel like sitting on pins and needles going into the Roval, which I feel like Jones is going to be, considering he needs to make up a huge amount of points to move on in the playoffs, I don't feel good for Jones going into the Roval at Charlotte. So now putting Richmond in our rearview mirrors, we'll get into my 3 things to look ahead to next week for the inaugural Cup Series race at the Roval at Charlotte.
Yippee! Here we go!
Number 1. What madness will ensue? If we just look at all the testing videos from the Roval at Charlotte, it's just been a mess in testing. Ryan Blaney lost it, went to the tire barriers. Darrell Wallace Jr. lost it going into turn 1 and crashed into those tire barriers. Eric Jones lost control of his car and crashed. William Byron lost brakes going into turn 1 and just went flying into those tire barriers, demolishing his car. And Alex Bowman lost control of his car, crashing. So that's throughout all the tests, that's 5 wrecks that have already occurred at the Roval. And now we're going to put 40 cars on this track for the first time ever. I don't see good things happening here, and I could see maybe 8 or more playoff drivers being taken out of this race, and that it's not 5 minutes anymore. The 6-minute damage clock will play a huge role in who advances in these playoffs. And if we want this race to be even more of a mess, just imagine if it rains a little bit in Charlotte. Now on to number 2. Will the other road course results translate? With this being the first time we go to the Roval at Charlotte, I believe many people will be looking at Sonoma and Watkins Glen's finishes to see if they'll translate to the road course at Charlotte. The top 5 at Sonoma were this: Martin Truex Jr. won the race, Kevin Harvick finished 2nd, Clint Bowyer finished 3rd, and Chase Elliott finished 4th, and Kyle Busch finished 5th. The only thing I can really see translating from Sonoma to the Roval is how wide the track racing surface is. As we know, going up the hill at Sonoma, it kind of funnels into a small gap for most cars to fit through, and turn 1 looks to be the same at the road course at Charlotte. The results from Watkins Glen were this: Chase Elliott won, Martin Truex Jr. finished 2nd, Kyle Busch finished 3rd, Daniel Suarez finished 4th, and Eric Jones finished 5th. Now the similarities I think from the Roval and Watkins Glen will be that the speeds will be about the same. As we know, Watkins Glen is a very fast-paced road course. Now with the Roval at Charlotte incorporating most of the oval track, I expect speeds to be really high and drivers relying on those brakes really hard to get from a really high fast-paced speed all the way down to maybe first gear to get to about 30 miles an hour at some points of the track. Now on to number 3. Guys who are in trouble. With most people thinking impending doom for the Roval race, where most cars will come out looking like they've been through a blender instead of being on a racetrack, guys who are either not good at road courses or really deep behind in points are feeling for the worst this weekend at Charlotte. 7 drivers who I think are in real big trouble going into this weekend's race are Denny Hamlin, who's minus 29 points. He's last currently on the grid, sitting in 16th, and he looks like he's going to need to win to move on, or everyone crash on lap 1 and him getting all the stage points. Number 2 is Eric Jones. Eric Jones is minus 21 behind 12, and looks like he'll need a miracle to move on here too. And Eric Jones has been hit or miss on the road courses. He finished 5th at Watkins Glen and 7th at Sonoma, with these finishes being pretty decent, but with the points gap that Jones is behind the 12th place and moving on in the playoffs, he's going to need to step up and maybe win a stage or both stages and collect as many stage points as humanly possible, and more than likely finish in the top 5 if he wants to move on in these playoffs, and hopefully not revert back to his rookie self where he finished 25th at Sonoma. The third guy is Jimmie Johnson. Jimmie Johnson has showed speed in the past couple races, but throughout this season, Jimmie Johnson has been on a downward spiral and hasn't really done anything great this season. At Watkins Glen, Jimmie Johnson finished in the 30th position, which if he finishes 30th here at the Roval, Jimmie Johnson won't be making it out of this round of the playoffs. Jimmie Johnson's only minus 6, which puts Jimmie Johnson in a decent spot to be any points down. But if we just look at his past performances, I don't see Jimmie Johnson doing really well here, and more than likely getting eliminated here, unless maybe Rick Hendrick dips into that Chase Elliott road course car and gives one to Jimmie Johnson. Then he can maybe be moving on in the playoffs. The next driver is Clint Bowyer. Clint Bowyer is currently minus 4 and is in 13th position in the points. Clint Bowyer had a good finish at Sonoma, finishing 3rd, and he was one of the best 3 cars all day. But this race at Richmond, Clint Bowyer's car was just gone for most of the race, and he rallied to put together a top 10 finish. This has me wondering if the number 14 team has gone cold at the wrong time, and maybe Clint Bowyer could be out of the first round of the playoffs. Clint Bowyer doesn't need to put on a heroic effort to move on at the Roval. He just needs to stay out of trouble and keep the fenders on the car, and maybe he'll be moving on. The next guys who I think are in trouble are above the cut line, but just barely. And the next guy is Alex Bowman. Alex Bowman was 16th going into these playoffs, and now he sits 11th. Just 5 points up on the cutoff line. Bowman seems to be at the wrong place at the wrong time when he needs it the most, and I feel like that's going to bite him here at the Roval. And plus, he's already wrecked at the test earlier this season, so now just imagine with the cars on the track how much nerves will be in Bowman and what will more than likely happen to him. Sitting in 12th in the standings is Ryan Blaney. Ryan Blaney is currently plus 4, just barely squeaking ahead of Clint Bowyer in these playoff standings. As we saw earlier in the test at the Roval this season, Blaney wrecked. And with Blaney streaking this season where he's been up one race, down the next, then he's back up, then he's back down. Who knows what Blaney we're going to get at the Roval. I don't have a good feeling about Ryan Blaney heading into the Roval. And the last guy is Austin Dillon. Austin Dillon has surprised a couple people in these rounds of the playoffs, where he finished 11th at Las Vegas and 6th at Richmond. But if you look at Austin Dillon's performances at the road courses this year, they haven't been good. He finished 16th at Sonoma, which for a playoff driver isn't good. And at Watkins Glen, he finished 27th, which is also not good for any kind of driver. And now going into the Roval, just 10 points up on 13th. I don't have a good feeling about Dillon here. He hasn't performed at the road courses well this season, and I feel like his past 2 good races in these playoffs is going to go to waste with just an abysmal performance at the Roval for Austin Dillon, where he'll go out in the first round like most thought. So I'll do it for 3 wide this week. Leave your thoughts about Richmond in the comment section below and what you think will happen at the craziness of the Roval. If you like the video, hit the like button. If you like what I'm doing on the channel, hit the subscribe button. And as always, thanks for watching.